Alrighty, so we're going to begin tonight with Lesson 13. That consists of chapters 17 and 18. We're going to look at chapter 17 tonight because this is a fairly extensive lesson. As we pick up steam here towards the end of the book, we're just about there. This obviously took longer than the 15 weeks we had allotted, quite a bit longer, but I think it was necessary to give it its due diligence. So we are on chapter 17, and this is a very interesting chapter, very, very heavy on the imagery. Some of the chapters are a little heavier than others, darker than others. This one in particular is heavy and dark. There's a lot here. So let's look at, we'll go through here. Let's look at the first 6 verses. And one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I shall show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And upon her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw a woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly." So, that's quite a bit there right off the bat. So, the judgment of the great harlot has already been pronounced in 14:8. Now it is visualized. So if we look back at chapter 14, verse 8, when it talks about that, we'll just take a quick glance at that. And another angel, second one, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality." Chapter 14, verse 8. Yep. It's there in your notes on the very first thing where it says introduction. So when we talk about, it says Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. There's a lot of parallels here to what we just read, what we're going to read, and what we're going to see here as we investigate what this means. So in verse 1, we see that it says, "who sits on many waters." That will be explained in verse 15. But then the phrase that shows up, the great harlot. So strong wording here. And so according to verse 18 says, "And the woman whom you saw in the great city, or is the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth." Now, this says in our notes, the great harlot is Babylon according to verse 18. But if we go back to 14:8, it's a little clearer, isn't it? Babylon and she, right? There it says Babylon. This just says the great city. So they all work together. Now the question is, what is the immediate context? What is the current historical setting and context which would readily identify with this as the great harlot? Okay, so remember what we said? We said that, remember back, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, that we made the correlation with Babylon, right? And that it equals Rome. What did they have in common? What did they have in common? What did you say? Israel nation? Okay, so what happened? What was the primary relationship between Babylon and historical and Rome and historical? is persecution, but primarily, you got to think, what did they both do that just obliterated their complete world? What'd you say? They destroyed the temple. Hey, that's the center of their world, yes? So what, I mean, everybody was kind of right. We're just narrowing down specifics. So they each destroyed the temple. Right? And there's obviously tied to this, there's persecution in general, regardless. And they were both known for, what about their worship? Yeah, idolatry, right? So they both were known for idolatry and all sorts of pagan worship. So, there were a lot of similarities between the two, yep. And so, when John's writing this, it could have an immediate fulfillment, but also a distant fulfillment. So the immediate fulfillment, when he talks about the great harlot who rides upon the beast, we'll talk about that here in a minute because that's important. So there's a lot of similarities between Babylon and Rome, and we're going to see. So in the College Press NIV commentary that I've been reading, that's Chris Davis, I've been quoting you some stuff. He says that this immediate fulfillment in context that this is speaking of almost this entire chapter is Rome. But that doesn't mean it's its only fulfillment. Because remember when we talk about the beast out of the sea and the beast out of the land? Rome is represented in that, but not the only ones represented in that. And those, remember how they were intertwined? Because Rome, they practiced what kind of worship by the time of Domitian was being practiced? What was the big thing about that time with Domitian? It really started picking up steam from Nero and really under Domitian. It was Caesar worship, where they had to bow down to the images of Caesar. So that really was in full effect by this time. And then we know the things that went on in Babylon as well. So the great harlot is Babylon, but Babylon is what? Rome. And then Rome is representative of what would come after it. In Isaiah 23:16 and Nahum 3:4, it both talks about in Isaiah. He's speaking of Babylon, I believe. No, Nineveh. Are they both speaking of Nineveh? Isaiah 23:16 and Nahum 3:4, they both refer to, it's either Nineveh or Babylon, or let's look them up. Someone look up to Isaiah 23:16. I think Nahum 3:4 is referencing Nineveh, and they refer to Nineveh as the great harlot. Now, where was Nineveh the capital of? Yeah, the Assyrians, right? And so this kind of language is used. Yeah, Tyre, right? Tyre is spoken of as the great harlot. Yeah. And then in Nahum, I believe it is Nineveh that is talking about there. So that language is used in other places. Now the question then is, why is Babylon referred to as a harlot? What about them would they be referred to that way? Now, in James chapter 4. Yeah, James 4:4. He's talking to Christians, right? And he says, "You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God? Therefore, whoever wishes to make a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." So this idea of adulteresses here. So when harlot is used in this sense here in Revelation and what we saw in Isaiah and Nahum, is it in the same sense as where it's talking about adulteresses in like James? Is it in the same sense? It's a little different. Here's how it's different. With Babylon and Rome, did they have a covenant relationship with God that was broken? No. So it's in a different sense. So you can't equate where it says that when Christian people go after idols or other things that is idolatry, and that means they're playing the harlot. That is used in the New Testament, but that's not. It's the same but different. So there's you come back to Romans chapter 1. You see, because even though they don't have a covenant relationship with God, they're still a godless, idolatrous. Ancient Babylon was. Idolatry equates to harlotry. It symbolizes this idea here. It symbolizes human society without God. She, the harlot, the Babylon, epitomizes power, inhumanity, and hatred of all that the church stands for. So there's a lot summed up here in verse 1, right off the bat. So in verse 2, we see here this phrase, those who dwell on the earth are those who do not have the mind of Christ. So it's a phrase referring to those that dwell upon the earth. And then the words for harlot and immorality, you could also substitute that word in some translation where immorality is written, is the word fornication. So either way, they both come from the same Greek word from which we get our word pornography. It's pornos. And so there's some similarity there. And then this is interesting. In verse 2, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. Immorality and drunkenness go together in a sinful world. However, the symbolism carries us beyond the literal meaning to portray that estranged state of mankind who refused to live in harmony with God's will and degrades himself with satanic living. So there's some pretty strong thoughts and imagery as we get here. Now, that is interesting. We've talked about the wilderness before, because if you recall with the woman who was with child in chapter 12, was it 12? Yeah. When it talks about that they went into the wilderness there, this is not the same thing when we talks about over here in chapter 17 when it says a wilderness, where John received his vision as a desolation of evil. In verse 3 it says, and he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. So don't equate this wilderness with the one that we talked about in chapter 12. It's different. It's different imagery, but it is interesting. So then we come to the scarlet beast. So scarlet, red. In chapter 13, verse 1, we read of another beast, didn't we? And he stood on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. So we see now that the great harlot is riding upon the beast, sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So that is the beast of 13:1. So that the beast coming out of the sea. So what did we say that was representative of? The beast out of the sea is representative of world powers. So that would fit then. If the immediate fulfillment is Rome, would that fit? It does. So then, as we move into verse 4, we start getting in the description of this woman. Now, this is interesting because the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet. That seems nice, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. So what's the image you get there? I mean, so far we're talking about beasts with horns and diadems and 7 heads and this kind of thing. What right off the bat, what kind of thoughts do you get here looking at that? royalty. It's kind of someone of a high position. Beauty, ugly. What do we have here? What's it being portrayed as? Just very appealing to the eye, well adorned, something very visually pleasing from the outside, right? Something that's alluring. Is that the image you get here? But then it says what? But then a cup, right? A gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. Now, we talked about another woman we just made mention of, 12:6. She is completely different from that woman in chapter 12. So when we remember when we did that study, who we said that the woman represented?
God's people from the Old Testament.
And the New. Primarily the church, but we had to have an understanding then how that could bring about the Messiah, right? So that's where we included all of God's people, including the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, but primarily referring to the church. You guys remember that? So this is in complete opposition from the woman of chapter 12 is completely different than the woman that we're talking about here, the great harlot. So that if the woman of chapter 12 was representative of God's people, then this would be representative of Satan's people, right? Her garments indicate great wealth. The contents of her golden cup suggest wickedness. Would somebody, well, just make this in your notes and look this up because it's a fairly lengthy passage. But a lot of this imagery of the golden cup and these things is pulled from Jeremiah chapter 51. Verses 6 through 14. And there's a lot of similarities to this passage in this verse and then that passage there in Jeremiah. Well, I don't want to tear that apart tonight, but I just wanted you to have that for your notes. Would somebody read Psalm 73:3? You got that, Danielle? Yeah, so isn't this interesting? See, if it's beautiful and well adorned and powerful and high and mighty and all these things and successful and all this kind of stuff, I mean, let's all be honest. Have we all not as Christians wondered maybe a little bit about how is it that someone that is so wicked is so rich or wealthy? Or, I mean, we've wondered that, right? And so when we understand these things, when we think of it from these perspectives, it's fairly simple to realize that many times those people in those positions are there. Why? How have they gained that position? Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Well, and then it reminds me of that verse in Matthew. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? And there's a lot of people out there that have lost their soul for material gain. And then at that point, then it's involving all sorts of wickedness. Now, this is where it gets a little interesting. Go ahead. Oh, it's chapter 6 or 51, 6 through 14. You're welcome. Now, the identity of the woman is made clear upon her forehead. See, it was the practice during the days of the Roman Empire for prostitutes to identify themselves with names written on headbands and worn. Now, what does that tell you about the society in general? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just completely, there was no shame. What's that? Well, yeah, yeah, well, I mean, for an individual to walk around with something like that, like, I mean, we're not quite there yet. I mean, yeah. But I mean, it's really the same. I mean, because there's certain people in certain places and certain clothing, But in Europe, as I understand it, it's very well known with the red light districts. I mean, and they purposely identify areas where, so it's nothing new under the sun. But the names written here are interesting. The first thing it says, a mystery. Now, if it's a mystery, then why is it says what it is? Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. The great harlot, that's her name. What's the mystery? Well, it was a mystery until this was revealed. So this is the revelation of that mystery. Now, ask yourself this. If you were John and you wanted to get this kind of a message out to all Christians, was using Babylon, the great harlot, wise? Yeah, I mean, it would take someone who didn't know. See, this talks about those that don't have understanding, that they're not going to know what this means, but those who do, they know what it means. So that's one thing we always need to keep in mind here. We look at this sometimes, and it's what we were talking about the other day. And we're like, well, how in the world did they know what it means? They knew what it meant. And when you really think about it, it's not that hard. It's not that hard to make the equation here, to equate these things, but
It's not common knowledge for us that it was for them.
well, yes. And then our job is to figure out what it meant to them when it was written. But there was also those in that place and time that would have had no clue what they meant by this. Why do they care about Babylon? They've been gone forever. Right? So that's one of the typical things about apocalyptic literature, is that in language, is that it's used almost not necessarily as code language, but it's, in a sense, that's what it was for, to protect the message and what was being sent, that they could use this language and then get across certain things that Babylon the Great, or Rome the Great Harlot, they might have taken offense to that. You think? Yeah. So the mystery is being revealed. It was a mystery, but now it's being revealed. It was and it was a subject to be made known. As a mother, we are convinced of the character of her offspring. So, if this is the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth, then we're saying that this is not just an individual, but it's representative of a whole grouping. So the grouping, we would say those that are, I guess you would say, of the devil. So in verse 6, and I saw a woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. Now that is, that's pretty powerful imagery, right? What is that telling us? Just that there's definitely persecution. But what else? What is Babylon's relationship, if we want to say the great harlot Babylon, or even Rome at this point in time? What is their relationship to this persecution? What are their feelings about it? Is it something that is a necessary evil that they're carrying out? They what? Yeah, remember this is something that they crave. This is persecution that they are drunk on the blood of the martyrs. That imagery is just, it's really quite, sickening, but what it tells you is that it's that they've consumed it to the point of drunkenness. It's something that they've pursued and craved. And when we talk about what the saints would include those before the time of Christ. And we'll talk about this here. John's wonder is amazement, not admiration. But I want to read you this that talks about this a little bit more. What sort of abominations does Rome commit? See, he's saying the immediate fulfillment here is definitely Rome, and I would agree with him. I don't see how there's any way around it. And notice I say immediate, because it's not only. There's distant fulfillments too. So what sort of abominations does Rome commit? Remember what's in the cup? To find out, we must look in her cup. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. What is the whore drinking? He uses strong language here. The blood of the saints. This is filthy wine of her adulteries, the cup that her idolatry leads her to drink. And Rome does not merely sip from the cup. Instead, she is drunk with the blood of the saints. She gorges herself with the lives of the martyr Christians. Furthermore, she passes the cup to others, encouraging them to drink as well. As a result, the inhabitants of the earth are also intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Chapter 18 and 19 will show that to the Lord God Almighty, the murder of his faithful servants is an abomination for which Rome will pay with her life. It's really, he did a good explanation there of what we're talking about here is. Now, we're going to see how not only was it for them, but there was also they also influenced surrounding lesser kingdoms to do the same thing. It wasn't just Rome, it was everywhere under their influence. So let's move on now. We've read through verse 6. So do we have any questions or comments so far before we pick up through the next section? Alrighty. So we'll pick up with verses 7 and 8. And we'll read through verse 13. It's quite a bit there, actually. Well, let's just go through verse 10, and then we'll do 11 and 13. And the angel said to me, "Why do you wonder?" Now remember, when he talks about when I saw her, I wondered greatly. It wasn't admiration. It was just kind of almost like a shock and awe kind of thing. And the angel said to me, "Why do you wonder? I shall tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and to go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth will wonder, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the worlds, when they see the beast, that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while." Now, we've got a pretty good foundation of understanding so far in how to approach some things, but this is tricky. Because it just said this is this, and it's this, and it's this. Which can be a little confusing when we say, okay, well, usually this is this, it's not this, this, and this. But that's not always the case. So what I want you to do here is when we talk about these things here, is when it says that come on, where'd you go? The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And they are the 7 kings. So there's 2 different things here that we're talking about. So that you can use multiple types of imagery describing the same thing, but to bring out different facets. And that's what we have happening here. So there's different analogies being used to describe different qualities of the same thing. Okay, so let's, with that in mind, approach that. So the angel is going to reveal the mystery. The beast is satanic world power. We've established that. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing. Now, was and is not and is about to come. Right? Did you pick up on that? What does that sound like? What is it similar to? God who was, who is, and who is to come, right? It's similar to that, but it's different. How is it different? Is not. So this is, in a way, it's almost kind of mockery. Was and is not and is about to come. That is interesting. See, if it's talking about, like possible explanations here, the similarity of Domitian to Nero as a person and as an emperor, it could be talking about that it's different emperors, and who was and then who is not. So by this time, who is not out of those two, Domitian and Nero? And he gone. So Domitian and is about to come could be representative of others that come after. The belief of the resurrection, remember we talked about that there were some that believed or that thought he might come back and then cause further problem. Or this idea of a constant revival of satanic world power. This is kind of what we really need to focus on here. In contrast with the never-dying life of God, world power is constantly passing away to be reborn in new forms, which in turn are in new forms, which in their turn perish. Okay, so that's important to think about here, and let's just see if this bears out in history. We see that there are world powers that are harsh to Christianity, right? That are or God's people, and then a lot of times what would happen to them? They would fall or be conquered, right? Let's just start with the Assyrians, right? So they, at one point in time, Nineveh was great, and then they were conquered, right? And as they were conquered, another sort of evil took its spot, and who was that? Babylon, right? And then Babylon was, as we've talked about, was a world power, and they was, and they is not. They were set down, but then there was another one ready to take their spot. Yeah, and so this cycle just keeps on going, doesn't it? And so here we have three stages are marked out in the existence of world power. It was, it is not now. It ascends from the bottomless pit to go into destruction. The ascending from the bottomless pit and going into destruction indicate permanent attributes of the beast rather than single episodes in his career. That's a little wordy, but what it's saying is these are the attributes that ascend and that give power to the next one. Passing the baton. Yeah, so Assyria was carrying the baton till they got knocked down, and so it's like this power of the beast now ascends and hands the baton to the next. See, it's by the power. Does this make sense? And so that's what this is describing. This existence, non-existence, with existence, and subsequent reappearances describes the same truth as expressed by the mortal wound that was healed. This existence, non-existence, with existence, and subsequent reappearances. That's funny.
Who would you consider to be the world power but evil today? It's such as Rome was, but no longer.
Well, I'm not limited to any one. Just look around, and you've got genocide of Christians. They're trying to wipe them out right now in Africa. China is, North Korea. There's many places in the world that are. So this is not just There's not just one baton, that there's many in different places and times where this process is taking place, where there are powers that oppress God's people. So, yeah, and unfortunately, there may come a time when our country fully takes the baton. They're in the process. They're in the process. That's my opinion. I hope that we could turn the tide, but I believe we're firmly in the process of becoming a world power that oppresses Christianity. And I hope it never takes the forms of what we know that happened under Rome, and it's happened in other places, but I pray that that never happens. So, we see then that this 7 heads, it says, are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So, a mountain, sitting upon a mountain would indicate what? It would indicate great elevation, and great elevation, the high idea of being high, sitting exalted as a world power. Some see a resemblance to Rome, a city built on 7 hills. Perhaps so, I would agree. But there is more to this picture, and I would agree with that as well. Rome simply offers a prime example of power in opposition to God. You see that? That prime example? So, earlier on, this was the prime example. So much so that they could easily talk about Babylon as Rome and Rome as Babylon. Now, as John writes, this is the prime example of what we're talking about here. And so then following this, the different prime examples, because there's been other smaller ones, but there's been other prime examples of world powers that oppress Christianity, opposition to God. In verse 10, the 7 heads are equivalent to 7 mountains and 7 kings. So we have 3 things here. So we know that 7 heads, if we just talk about the heads themselves and other things, we've said that represents what? Great wisdom, intelligence, earthly wisdom, mind you. 7 mountains, and then the 7 kings. But the perspective is different in each instance. See, satanic power is being visualized as intelligent, powerful, elevated, strong, and having authority. You see, those are all different ways of talking about. See, the 7 heads wouldn't necessarily, from that imagery, you wouldn't get having great power and authority. But if it's the same as 7 kings, which this says it is, then you can add in this idea of understanding of great power and authority. So that's why there's more added here, is to give us that idea. Now, let's talk about verse 10. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he will remain a little while. What? So, what could this mean? So what we need to do here then is find 5 kings or rulers. We identify them by name, and then we know the one who is, then we know that's the one that he's writing about. And then there's only going to be one more. Is that the way we should approach it? Jesus is not an evil king. Yeah. No, these are talking about this 7 these are bad. The 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. So, okay, so this idea of was, is, and is to come. Okay, so that could be the concept here. Well, then, what would be how would we get that from the numbers? All right, mathematicians. So what is it? If we understand it from this perspective of 5, 1, and 1 equals 7, then if we look at it from that perspective, so what could we then say? Because this was, right? This was, is. It's almost like Kentucky verbiage. And this one was to come. Yeah. Okay, so the 5 then would be representative of what's in the past, not any specific 5, but most of where we're at, if the were to, what he's talking about here, if indeed this is represented by Rome, the Roman leaders in specific here, then the who was would be the ones that have all the ones all up to Domitian, maybe? Is that possible? So this would be representative of what? And then what would this be representative of? This will be the ones that follow, but not necessarily one, and it's not going to be much longer. See that? Now, what do we know about history? True. Specific to Rome, though. Yeah. When? No, that's Jerusalem. Yeah, I think it's around 436. So I don't believe this is too far-fetched here. This is, when you talk about the number 7, it's speaking of who are the 5, the one and the other. Some make them refer to the emperors of Rome. Specifically, they try to make them match 7 individuals. But it is a guess as to which emperor you should start with unless you are certain of the date of revelation. See, what he's saying here is that there are those that try to say there's 5 individuals. They try to pick the right one to start with, depending on... So there are some who interpret Revelation as that this is Nero, that this is written in the 60s, not the 90s. So if it's written in the 60s, then you got to bump those 5 back, right? Do we have to bump anything back with this understanding? Why? Because it includes all of them prior to the current. Because it's symbolic. Another suggestion is that Rome was the 6th of the great world powers, the first being Egypt, followed by Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece. Commentators add other meanings. At any point there is opposition to God, but the continuance of this opposition is limited. He must remain a little while. So, this is one thought, if you look at it from that perspective. Possibility. So then, in verse 11, so let's move forward. Do you have any questions or comments? You're squirming a little bit.
No, I'm just
Oh, go, well, think. Out loud.
Well, we're talking about Jews. The one to come could be.
Oh, well, if you're looking at immediate versus distant fulfillment, certainly.
I mean, I'll just read you Kentucky language there, and I just sort of.
It got him really stirred up.
As far as that goes, truck could be the big. Oh, that's all right, yeah. Oh, we're just gonna, well, it is
We're back in Sunday school, right, Kyle? Chasing rabbits. There's a whole herd of rabbits get loose in there every week. You need to bring your shotgun. So, yeah, Paul's not here. We all let loose rabbits from time to time, but Paul has a whole herd of them. He just waits. He just sits there. You ready? All right. Okay, verse 11. Verse 11. And the beast, which was and is not, is himself also an eighth, and is one of the seven, and he goes to destruction. An eighth, and is the one of the seven. Dude, that is, whew. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. The eighth is like the seventh. Now, this idea is kind of what we're talking about here. The seventh would be, if this was specifically tied to Rome, but then it says the eighth is like the seventh. And we could say that any future ruler who tries to put himself in place of Christ. Absolutely. Yeah. Like the Pope. Yeah, any future ruler who tries to put himself in the place of Christ, the eighth is like the seventh. In apocalyptic language, 8 was an all-inclusive number for the totality of all supernatural powers. What John is saying is that one after another the kingdoms of the world fall. Then the last of all, that apparent supernatural power which sustains them all, should go to destruction. So we understand that all the puppets, one puppet's taken another puppet's place, but the puppet master eventually is going to fall. And that puppet master is Satan himself. As strong and intelligent as the beast may be, his end will be in hell. Verse 12, the horns symbolize power and strength. We know this. 10 symbolizes completeness. Kings symbolize authority in the political arena. The relationship of the kings with the beast indicates lesser power subservient to the great power of the beast. The 10 horns may signify all the various satanic powers that combine to make the beast the totality of all satanic dominion. And then 1 hour indicates a short but definite period of time. The power of the kings is limited. We know this. So, verse 13. They have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. The devil's propaganda is effective in uniting evil powers for the accomplishment of his will. The one purpose is Satan's purpose. So, verse 14 through 18. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, the waters which you saw, remember the waters back in verse 1, where it said the great harlot who sits on many waters? Right? You see, this is important. The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So what is that saying if we go back to verse 2? The great harlot then has power and dominion and control and effect upon what? Yeah. And we know that to be true. And the 10 horns, verse 16, which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot. Now this is where this gets really interesting. And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. Huh? Keep that in mind. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose, by having a common purpose, and by giving their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God should be fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw in this is this great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, 16 here is that we could spend some time there. And we'll talk about it a little bit. So if verse 14, when it says they will wage war against the Lamb and the Lamb will overcome them, what did we just get through discussing last week? Armageddon, right? Now that's the place we tried to give you a proper understanding of that, as opposed to all the sensationalistic World War III stuff that's out there. See, I bet you anything right now, and when there was like 8 channels, it was easier to see TV preachers. I don't see them much anymore. They're on there, but it's not. When you were surfing 8 channels, you know you know what I'm talking about. It seems like you'd see them more. I don't see them as much as more, but I know they're there. But I bet you they're foaming at the mouth over this whole moving the embassy to Jerusalem and all this kind of stuff. I guarantee you they're talking about this and blood moons and all this kind of stuff. They're equating what's happening with this. In fact, I'm going to print this off for you next week because today someone shared a really good article on this idea of Israel's role in the end times. See, the people that are in dispensational premillennialism, they believe that Israel has a huge role in the end times. So anything that happens with that, they're just like, ooh, we're almost there. What this article does is it explains that all these prophecies that they attribute to the end times were actually fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so remember we talked about now that when it talks about Israel and Jerusalem and all these kind of things, it's talking about the church. The kingdom, all these things is talking about the church. And so I'm going to print that off for you so you have it as another reference for that because that's so important. So, verse 15 and 16. These will hate the harlot. Now, what is it's saying here? It sounds like they're fighting and warring with one another. Jockeying for position, okay? Well, just think about this on an individual level. When you talk about Romans chapter 1, and when it talks about that they denied God as the creator and worshiped the creature, and then it says that they pursued their passions and lusts, and then God gave them over. So then at that point, what happens? This is an image of the self-destructive power of evil. See, if you think about it, on an individual level, evil causes a person to self-destruct. Right? So when you think of that on a grand scale, that's what's going to happen as well. Sin that is a great delight in the beginning because it becomes a disappointment in the end. And many times there's wars within that cause the destruction. Now there is an interesting phrase here for God has put it in their hearts to execute His purpose. Now this is very similar to the discussion that we had about in Esther. Well, so is this saying, for God has put it in their hearts to execute His purpose. So, put it in whose hearts? So God is causing them evil, through their evil, to execute His judgments and His purposes? See, this is a very interesting thing here because this is where we discuss the relationship of God's providence and sovereignty and man's free will. Yes. Yes. Was Haman made to? But God, he allowed things and guided certain things. What did we say that God guided during this process when we talked about Esther? Do you guys remember what we said? Well, this is what I believe. I firmly believe this. He brought to mind to who? To the king to read the book because he couldn't go to sleep, and next thing you know, Haman's hung. Right? So I believe God's providence, that in His foreknowledge, that all these things work together. And so God, is there any other biblical example of people choosing evil that God used for His purposes? Another great example of God's... Pharaoh, right? Because the word, Pharaoh hardened his heart, right? And so who did it? God hardened his heart? God caused his heart to be hardened? Okay? When we understand that, so if we say that God is the one who hardened it, then don't we take away personal responsibility from Pharaoh? So through Pharaoh's free will decisions, God permitted for his heart to be hardened. God didn't purposely harden it, because then we can make God the author of his poor decisions. See, there is some difficult things there when we talk about this. What's another example? Let's move away from that one, because I want to get bogged down in that. There was a certain brother. Yeah, right? So what happened with that? If things would have happened as they did, and the brothers did not do what they did, what would have happened? Well, what would have happened to the people? They would have died, right? Probably. But we know the events that all worked out, and what did Joseph say?
It was for good.
Yeah, they meant it for harm, but God meant it for good, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about here. So when it says, for God has put in their hearts to execute his purpose, God is not causing anybody to do evil. Would you agree with this statement? Because if God causes, see, the way this is worded is very similar to the wording with Pharaoh. And so if God is the one who does it, then he would be ultimately responsible for it, and we cannot associate. I'm not willing to associate any evil act with something that God causes. Absolutely. And there are certain things that I think that he can specifically guide, that there is providence involved. I think things like the weather, certain circumstances that God, he brings things to mind. And then we have the choice then to act upon. Sure, to come to power. Yes. Yeah, because, even though he allowed them to come to power to execute his judgment, they were still responsible for what they did, and that's why we have the book of, what book speaks, is Nahum speaks against the fall of Nineveh and the Assyrians, right? That they're going down, even though ultimately it all worked according to God's plan. It's when you really start digging into how man's free will works with God's providence and sovereignty, it is deep into the pool stuff, but it only magnifies his omniscience and his omnipotence. It really does. So, some see the initial fulfillment of this verse in the fall of Rome in AD 476, so we need to change that. I had 2 of the 3 right. I was 66% correct there. God manifests his greatness by making the works of Satan accomplish his own glory. And I want to read you one thing out of Tower of Truth, and then we'll conclude, because this is a good way to end it. Undoubtedly, wicked people have no awareness that God may be fulfilling his plan through their works. God manifests his own greatness by making the very works of Satan accomplish his own glory. Isn't that good? Sin caused Christ's death. But God used this event to magnify the greater power of the resurrection, which is the basis of the Christian hope. God is in control of all things. This does not destroy man's freedom of choice, nor does it force certain events to take place. God's omnipotence is magnified by the fact that He can and does maintain control all the time man is exercising his own free will. God's control does not limit Satan, as is indicated in chapter 20, and will ultimately bring all evil to the lake of fire, the consequences of sin. The theme of the chapter: world power is great, but it is doomed to hell. Chapter 17. Any questions or comments? Thanks.
I have a weird, I don't even know if I'm going to say this right. Is God's providence work now only through like our prayer life?
Not only, but I would say that our prayers is one of the primary ways that God still works providentially, is that He responds to our prayers. And so, that He allows us the opportunity to, I want to say this the right way, to affect the outcome. Is that our prayer? See, if we don't believe that our prayers can affect God's decisions, then why do it? So absolutely, our prayers are work. God works providentially in and around through our prayers. I wholeheartedly believe that. Certainly, yeah. And I think that's evidence for us to be able to say that our prayers, if offered in the proper manner, according to His will, with our heart in the right place, not selfish, that He absolutely, can intervene. Absolutely. Any other questions?
Prayers to God prolong His second coming.
You mean if someone were to say, hang on, we pray that you tarry?
Yeah, in a sense, yes. That's what I'm at.
Well, there's a whole lot of people saying it's Maranatha, right? Lord, come quickly. So who wins that one? You know? I honestly don't know that that's on the table. Well, you mean when, as far as time's concerned? Oh, yes. Could it cause His judgment to tarry? Yes. Moses, Abraham, with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? God was willing. So possibly. Any other questions? What's that? Oh, well, maybe. All righty.